This is the part of the movie where fans of Napoleonic history lose their minds a little bit.
Infantry advance!
Movie Napoleon seems to have forgotten that his soldiers have firearms. I'm Louee Dessent, I have a master's degree in history from Oxford University, and I'm also the host of Survive History, where we try to get as close as possible to the experience of soldiers from the past. In previous episodes, we've covered life in Napoleon's army, the British 95th Rifles, and the Battle of Waterloo. In this episode, we are going to break down whether you could actually survive under the command of this movie general, Joaquin Phoenix's Napoleon. We're going to analyse some of his decisions and behaviour in important scenes, discuss how those actions might play out in reality, and weigh up his performance against the real, historical Napoleon Bonaparte. Welcome to Survive History, guys. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. We start at the Siege of Toulon. Napoleon is a 24-year-old artillery officer right at the start of his career, and he's about to lead an assault on a British fort that overlooks the city.
Pints of beer and bottles of sherry to help them over there.
Okay, so we've got a really anxious looking Napoleon here supervising his men as they creep up to the walls of the fort. He's going to have to hope that his men don't notice that, because the general's demeanour during this period is extremely important and can have a big effect on the morale of his soldiers. He's probably looking nervous because his entire plan seems to depend on the British garrison being drunk and posting no sentries. If you're a soldier in this attack, that is a pretty big gamble. The real Fort Mulgrave outside Toulon that Napoleon attacked wasn't a big stone fortress like this one filmed in Malta. It was a hastily thrown up redoubt with earth embankments, part of the outer ring of defences around the city that the British and French royalists had set up. And they'd been under siege for months by this point, so it's quite unlikely that they were taken unawares, and they probably weren't partying either. So this is a highly coordinated attack involving artillery, party using scaling ladders, engineers blowing off the doors of the fort at one point. And we have to assume, like with all battles in this movie, that Napoleon has gone over the finer details of his plan off camera, as it were. We never really get to see those discussions or briefings with his officers. And that's a shame, because that really is at the heart of what made Napoleon a military genius.
Get the mortars up there!
So Napoleon has the advantage here of using these very versatile, very destructive, and also very portable mortars. No mortars like this actually existed at the time. These look a bit more like the swivel guns that would be used on ships. Mortars were used to great effect at the Siege of Toulon, but even the very smallest at the time, the Cohorn types, would have weighed about 40 kilograms and would have had a really sort of heavy wooden base alongside them. So if you were ordered to start climbing with one, you'd be pretty miffed. The main point, though, is there's really no incentive to try and carry these mortars up to the top of the fort. Mortars are designed to fire in an arc that loops up and over defences. Once you've got the high ground on top of this fort, regular cannons are going to be far more useful. Commanders during this era needed to strike a balance between being visible to their men at the sharp end of the fighting and also being zoomed out enough to make tactical decisions and react to events. So you could say that Napoleon is being pretty reckless here, but then again he does need to be on the top of those ladders to start directing things. His objective is to turn the 4 guns on the British fleet in the harbour. We know the real Napoleon was involved in close combat during this siege. He was actually wounded in the left thigh by a British bayonet, and years later he would proudly show off the scar to his friends. But crucially, he wasn't throwing himself into a sword fight, he was placing himself where he needed to be as an officer to coordinate the attack.
Fire! You know, he did shots!
So here we see Napoleon directing the artillery. That is his job at the siege, and it's the culmination of his own plan, which is to turn these guns on the British ships and hopefully force them to evacuate the city. It's quite interesting that he orders heated shot to be used in this scene, which is where you would place a cannonball in a furnace until it was glowing red, the idea being that it'd be very effective at setting wooden ships on fire. Napoleon loved this technique. He actually wrote manuals on how to do it properly, but it took about 45 minutes for the cannonball to achieve the right temperature, and it was very risky for the crews involved. You couldn't just order heated shot out of nowhere and expect it to appear. Unlike in this scene, in reality, the only ships that were destroyed during the Siege of Toulon were French. So once the besiegers had taken Fort Mulgrave and the other coastal batteries that overlooked the harbour, the British knew their position was untenable. They ordered an evacuation, but before they left, they set fire to 8 French ships of the line and 3 French frigates. Nevertheless, this was still a victory for the Republicans, and it was one that catapulted the young Napoleon into the spotlight. I'll admit it's easy to critique generals from the sidelines, but could you survive if you took command yourself? If you want to test your own tactical genius, you need to play War Thunder, the sponsor of today's episode. It's the most comprehensive vehicle combat game ever made, and it's available right now for free on PC, PlayStation, Xbox and mobile. You can take command of over 2,500 tanks, planes, helicopters and ships from 10 major nations, spanning everything from World War II fighters to modern rocket launchers. As a history fan, I appreciate the incredible attention to detail on their historic vehicles. Every single machine is intricately modelled to look and behave exactly like its real-world counterpart, right down to the historic markings, camouflage, and authentic sound effects. Combine that level of immersion with realistic graphics and epic PvP battles alongside a worldwide community of over 95 million players, and this game is a real treat if you have an interest in military history. Play War Thunder for free now using my links in the pinned comment or video description to sign up. For a limited time only, new players and those who haven't played in 6 months will receive a massive bonus pack on PC and consoles. It includes multiple premium vehicles, the exclusive vehicle decorator Eagle of Valor, 100,000 Silver Lions, and 7 days of premium account. Now, let's get back to the episode. Okay, we've seen our movie general rely heavily on the enemy's incompetence so far, and seen that he's a bit hot-headed when the battle starts. Let's see if he can keep his men alive during one of the most famous battles of the era, where Napoleon faced the emperors of both Austria and Russia. Okay, a few things to say already here. Our general is choosing to fight in what appears to be a snow blizzard. Now, we know that conditions at Austerlitz in reality were icy and very foggy, but it wasn't quite like this. And with these extreme conditions in mind, you might think that the soldiers would be wearing their greatcoats, known as the capote or manteau. I've worn one of them for our episode on Napoleon's army, and I'd certainly want it if I was fighting here. The soldiers were permitted to wear them when the weather was wet or cold, even in battle. And so if Napoleon, our movie general, has ordered his men to be in full parade dress for this work detail, that's pretty harsh.
More fires.
He tries to copy me, but he is a little boy who will make a terrible mistake. I am certain I will bring the laurels of another glorious victory to my army today.
On the other hand, it looks like Napoleon's men have had the luxury of spending the night in tents, whereas in fact, after 1793, the French army didn't carry tents. They had to bivouac, so that meant sleeping in any available buildings or outside around campfires. And we know that the night before Austerlitz, some French soldiers struggled to even find straw for their beds. These guys have got it easy. So we see here Napoleon touring some trench lines that his soldiers have dug. The director, Ridley Scott, seems to absolutely love trenches, and we're going to see quite a few of those in this film. We can say that being visible and confident in front of the men on the morning of battle did make a big difference. So the real Napoleon, the night before Austerlitz, went from campfire to campfire, encouraging his men. A conversation or even just a word from the emperor was something that a regular soldier would never forget. And as for those fortifications, those are great for your survival chances if you're in a position that you absolutely have to hold on to. If your battle plan depends on being mobile, then they are a complete waste of time and presumably quite hard to create in this frozen landscape. Now, on the real Austerlitz battlefield, there were two small villages on Napoleon's right flank called Telnitz and Sokolnitz, and the French soldiers placed there were basically bait so that the Austrian and Russian army would come down off the high ground known as the Pratzen Heights. And with a heavy amount of artistic license applied to both the landscape and the deployments here, that basic plan appears to have worked. As a French soldier here, your survival chances are massively helped by the way that the Austrians and Russians are conducting this attack. First of all, there appears to be no artillery bombardment preceding this massed block of infantry and cavalry intermingled coming to overwhelm the village. Something I think you probably already know is that horses aren't great at attacking fortifications. Napoleonic armies were well aware that horses wouldn't attack dense blocks of infantry, let alone soldiers behind barricades like this. And we see one horse crash through the fence like an armoured car, but actually I think most of the cavalry would be stopping short, and they'd probably be getting massacred in this scenario. Cavalry were looking for opportunities to attack formations in disarray or on their flanks, and they like to operate out in the open. And we know sabre-wielding Austrian hussars, like the ones shown quite nicely in this scene, were present at the battle. They were fighting around these villages of Telnitz and Sokolnitz, but they were out in the open between the villages. They weren't operating like this.
Send in the infantry! Take their position on the higher ground! Have the double!
Okay, this is the part of the movie where fans of Napoleonic history lose their minds a little bit. It's scream at the TV time. Training for Napoleonic soldiers involved weeks and weeks of marching in step, in formation, moving from column to line to column, until they were basically an automaton that was part of a well-oiled machine. Other than that, it was musket drill. It was learning to fire your weapon in a sequence of steps until that was second nature as well. If you were thrown forward in this kind of ragged bayonet charge from hundreds of meters out into a confused melee, you would be throwing away all of the advantages and the purpose of your training. You'd be throwing away your discipline, your position on the high ground, your firepower. It would be crazy. And were those trenches really just there for the soldiers to hide in? It seems pretty mad to make your soldiers dig several feet into the frozen earth when you could have just hidden them in the trees. I suppose the one thing we can say is that the biggest threat to Napoleon's soldiers in this situation would be the Austrian cavalry, who'd be looking for this golden opportunity to get in amongst these dispersed soldiers and cut them down. But of course, we know that the Austrian cavalry is already fully committed to the chaos in the village, and so they're probably unavailable to the enemy at this crucial point. In reality, the big battle-winning attack on the Pratzen Heights that was led by Marshal Soult would have looked very different to this. The French soldiers would have advanced in dense columns that could have been 50 to 60 men wide and 15 to 25 ranks deep. This huge block that had basically been a French tactic since the Revolution limited your ability to fire, but was thought to increase morale, and it did protect you somewhat against cavalry. It would have advanced with a lot of fanfare, music, chanting, and only when you were close to the enemy would this column have spread out into line formation, 3 ranks deep, so you could bring your muskets to bear against the enemy. On the question of this frozen lake at Austerlitz, there is some evidence of men and horses falling into what were basically icy fish ponds during a very difficult retreat for the Austro-Russian army after the battle. They were basically channeled into a narrow corridor on the southeast of the battlefield, while Napoleon's guns, newly installed on the Pratzen Heights, were able to fire down on them. Now, Napoleon claims several thousand soldiers were killed by his guns and drowned in these frozen lakes, but those ponds were actually drained afterwards, and only about 2 or 3 bodies were found, around 100 horses, so the reality was probably quite a lot less dramatic than is presented here. Okay, next up we're moving to Napoleon's invasion of Russia in 1812, the largest in history up to that point, involving some 600,000 men. And if this one is portrayed accurately, it's going to be very difficult to survive. Okay, so we have a French column moving through a wooded valley, perhaps in modern Ukraine or Belarus, which was part of the Russian Empire at the time. And they're coming under attack by what I can only assume are dismounted Russian Cossacks. They were highly feared, irregular troops, famed as light cavalry, actually. Here, they look a bit more like wildlings from Game of Thrones. But first, let's assess the French. So they are in hostile territory. The Grande Armée has got to assume that it's going to come under attack. So to be surprised in this way is pretty unforgivable. They're going to throw away the lives of a lot of their soldiers, and that's what happens here. French doctrine at this time was to have screening forces of light infantry, such as the voltigeurs or tirailleurs, who would move through this kind of terrain and flush out any enemy approaching the main column, or at least give an early warning to their presence. And all armies at this time would have had similar units doing this kind of job. So the British, for example, had the 95th Rifles, who were part of the Light Division. Now the ambushers are using these small mortars again that we saw at the Siege of Toulon. They appear to be highly accurate, at shooting that is, not historically accurate, and they've scored a direct hit on a French ammunition wagon, a caisson. Now once again, I don't know why you would want a mortar with a high arc of looping fire in this type of situation. A regular cannon, when you're overlooking the enemy, is going to be far more effective. And as the ambusher, you're going to want to make a quick getaway. Lumping one of these mortars around is not going to help you do that. Okay, so here we have the character of Marshal Ney, who was one of Napoleon's bravest but also most reckless lieutenants, and he is leading a group of cavalry into the woods to chase after these ambushers, and they are pretty effectively picked off by musket fire and in close combat. Leading a cavalry attack through the woods is something you see quite often in movies, but was generally avoided in history for several good reasons. First of all, you are likely to break the horse's legs if you try and move quickly over uneven ground with tree roots, that kind of thing. So you have to move slowly and carefully. And that negates your key advantages of speed and power as a cavalry force. And so musket-armed infantry have a big target to hit, and they can move just as easily as you can in this kind of forest. What this scene does capture quite well is the unease of French soldiers as they move through this strange and hostile country where they feel that veering off from the safety of the column might be a death sentence. And we know that in 1812, that is how French soldiers really felt, like they were being harassed from the sides, from in front, and from behind. Unlike in this scene, Russian Cossacks were almost always mounted. They'd appear quickly, fire off their carbines, use lances and sabres to tackle stragglers in an opportunistic way, and then disappear as quickly as they'd arrived. The Cossacks would usually have, at least some trappings of a uniform. They weren't quite wild mountain men as portrayed here. They absolutely did launch ambushes. There was a big one recorded at a place called Mir in modern-day Belarus early in the campaign, but it wouldn't have looked quite like this. So this is a great little scene to illustrate the Russian scorched earth strategy, which basically meant that they gave up lots of ground to the French, completely avoided battle, and destroyed anything that could sustain Napoleon's advance as they withdrew. Although we do see here the French emperor basically going house to house with a foraging party, a small group of soldiers looking for food and supplies. And that would be an incredibly bad idea, because these small detachments of soldiers are going to be far away from the main column. They're going to be the most vulnerable to Russian Cossacks and even the local peasants, who are not happy to see the French here. What's not really shown in this film is the incredible loss of life to disease on the advance to Moscow. Most people think that the Grande Armée was wiped out by the Russian winter on the retreat from Moscow. That's not true. Of the 600,000 men assembled for this invasion, only 100,000 ever reached the Russian capital. Diseases like typhus, trench fever, relapsing fever, along with starvation, desertion, and of course fighting, would have meant that the army was already in a dire state by this point. Even heat exhaustion on the long summer marches would have been a killer. And so the army we see here is actually in a better state than it would have been in reality. Okay, next we see the final throw of the dice for our movie Napoleon, the Battle of Waterloo. It's the big one. He's got the Anglo-Dutch army in front of him. He's got a Prussian army arriving on the scene shortly. So he has to act quickly to smash his rival, the Duke of Wellington, before he's completely surrounded. Now, we've covered the Battle of Waterloo in one of our episodes on Survive History. That was on the real battlefield in Belgium, so I'm really interested to see how it's presented here. So the French are beginning by pummeling the Allied ridge with cannon fire. That, at least, is a smart decision from our artillery genius. And they are helped massively by the fact that the British, despite having built these trenches again for cover, are running around exposing themselves to fire. In reality, we know that many British and Allied soldiers during this battle were told to lie down to avoid exactly this kind of situation. Napoleon had around 250 cannons at Waterloo. That was against Wellington's 150, so he had a big advantage there in firepower. And his plan was to use his grand battery to smash a hole in the Allied line that he could then exploit with a massive infantry attack. On the real battlefield, another of Napoleon's problems was that the Allied army was largely deployed on the reverse slope, so out of view for his cannons. And that meant that the cannonballs, certainly round shot, would simply hit the slope and bounce over their heads. Here, in the movie, he's got a much bigger target, so this is a good start for him and his army.
Infantry! Advance! Black Company! Back the army!
We see Marshal Ney here ordering the first wave of French infantry forward, out of the trenches, almost going over the top here. And I can only assume that those trenches are there to protect the French camp that we see over in the distance. But given that both sides are apparently in artillery range of each other and the British have the high ground, it's a pretty poor decision to pitch your tents in this position. I mean, I'm pretty sure no one is going to be getting much sleep if they're sleeping under the gaze of the British cannons. But that British artillery, for some reason, hasn't started firing yet. In reality, during this battle, no trenches for either side. Napoleon knew full well that he would be attacking, so he didn't need them, and Wellington had defences enough in the form of 3 walled farmhouse complexes along the front of his line. And both sides had only arrived at the battlefield the previous evening during an intense downpour where most men struggled to find any shelter from the elements on a bitterly cold night. So asking the troops to start digging trenches that were never going to be used would probably have started a mutiny. So in this scene, we see the British soldiers pretty much firing at will and firing well outside the effective range of their flintlock muskets, which was only about 100 meters. Maybe soldiers of the 95th or other units armed with the Baker rifle, which had a longer effective range, would have been firing in this way. They didn't have to wait for orders. They could fire when the opportunity presented itself. Redcoats wouldn't be doing that. And so the French, who are advancing, probably aren't going to be taking much damage from those particular defenders. Also, it's entirely British soldiers that we see in this scene. In reality, Wellington's army was only around a third British. The rest was made up of Dutch soldiers and soldiers from the different German states. So this scene is a little bit unfair to the other nations that fought at Waterloo. The British guns do finally start opening up on the advancing French, but they're actually doing fairly limited damage here, and that's because the French are advancing in a skirmish line. So they're not in a big block yet. This is the line of skirmishers who are there to harass the enemy ahead of the main advance. You can see through Napoleon's telescope there at the end of this scene how the skirmishers would have been deployed in this loose formation, and they were very effective at Waterloo at not giving the Anglo-Dutch army a break. Each French regiment would have had one company of voltigeurs who would have been trained to fight in this way. They would have been trained to load on the move, to use cover, to be agile in the fight, unlike the regular fusiliers.
Prepare to receive cavalry.
Okay, so we see the French cavalry been ordered to attack en masse, and they are extremely fortunate that the British army is being ordered out of its carefully prepared defences and onto the open ground to face them. Had the British simply stayed behind their massive earth embankments, they would have been perfectly safe and able to massacre this cavalry force at will. But the cavalry is still being sent forward on its own without infantry support. The British can see them coming a mile off and are able to prepare for their arrival. So from Napoleon's point of view, this is still quite a bad decision. At the real Waterloo, yes, a huge French cavalry attack was led up the Allied ridge because Marshal Ney thought Wellington was retreating. So he believed that he was going to find an army in complete disarray. What he'd actually seen was the road behind the Allied slope choked with wagons and deserters and reinforcements, but really Wellington wasn't in retreat and was ready to meet him. So the British infantry is doing exactly what they should do in this situation, forming these big squares so there's no chance of outflanking them. Typically the square would have two ranks of kneeling soldiers with their bayonets bristling outwards, two ranks behind who are able to fire outwards. And once that square is formed, it's almost impossible for the cavalry to break it. So they really need to catch the British before those squares close. Now, when we were on the field of Waterloo, recreating this battle, one thing that became apparent was that it was not easy to get a big group of soldiers into this formation easily, particularly with the noise, the uneven ground, and of course, in our case, lack of training. And it would require a lot of discipline, a lot of experience to get this right. And really, the French cavalry, their only chance is that the British get this wrong. Otherwise, they're toast. It would be really difficult for the cavalry commanders, or certainly Napoleon, to extricate his cavalry from this situation once they charged in. Even if they made the sensible decision to swerve the first square, the way that Wellington set them up, there'd be another one waiting behind it, and that created these killing fields for the cavalry. The reality was that these kind of squares were almost never broken by cavalry during the Napoleonic Wars unless they had a huge stroke of luck. So there were a couple of instances where wounded horses ploughed into the lines of soldiers and other cavalry were able to go in and behind and exploit it. But a conscious horse wouldn't charge into this, it would stop short. And so once you're in this situation, your best hope is to try and get out, reform close by, and wait for another opportunity. At the real battle, Ney's cavalry were completely surprised when they came over the crest of the ridge and found Wellington's army deployed in these squares. As I say, they thought that they were going to find an army in panic, and they were absolutely decimated by this attack. But by withdrawing and regrouping close by between each attack, Ney's cavalry was able to achieve something at Waterloo, and that was keeping these British and Allied squares under threat, so they remained in square. That presented a huge target for Napoleon's cannons. Huge casualties were inflicted on Wellington's army by cannonballs tearing through these squares. As it happens, our movie Napoleon hasn't taken advantage of that opportunity.
Infantry advance!
Battalion! And the infantry! Advance! Foot and forward!
One of the key issues with our movie Napoleon's tactics is that he seems to have forgotten that his soldiers have firearms. Yes, it was generally accepted that British musketry edged the French in these kind of battles, but it was still the French soldiers' primary weapon. Why aren't they shooting here? At the real battle, some of the British troops awaiting the final attack by the Imperial Guard actually lay down in the crops and remained hidden, and then sprang up to deliver a volley or two before the French could really organise themselves. But in this scenario, there's no reason for the French not to be firing. Another thing this movie doesn't really show is just how difficult the battlefield was to march over. It was thick mud on the day, there were these tall stalks of rye, there were bodies everywhere. The ground was completely uneven, and so marching in step would have been very difficult. That was one of the key lessons for me when we were trying to move around on this battlefield. If the ground is uneven and churned up, it's really hard to just stay in formation.
Prepare to charge! Charge!
Napoleon is here leading what's left of his cavalry in a charge towards the British lines. They are in line formation, not in square at the moment, so that does present at least a small opportunity. But as you can see from this frame, in order for this charge to succeed, they literally have to clear out their own infantry. It's a real mess. The infantry have disintegrated into this loose formation, this bayonet charge again, which, to be fair, for our movie Napoleon, did seem to work for him at Austerlitz, but here he is facing carefully prepared lines of redcoats. Not sure it's going to work again. In reality, Napoleon's final attack at Waterloo was probably doomed from the start, but it did put up a better fight than this. So it consisted of 8 battalions of the middle and old guard, at most around 5,000 men, and that's important to note because the first French attack at Waterloo under d'Erlon's corps had been 18,000 men, and that had been pushed back down the hill by Wellington's army. However, Napoleon didn't really have any other choice at this point. He was aware that the Prussians were already streaming onto the battlefield. At this crucial point in the battle where only a tactical masterstroke can snatch victory from the jaws of defeat, the last thing you need is your general fighting sword in hand in the middle of this melee. He can't see what's happening around him, he can't issue orders, and of course he might actually be killed. In reality, Napoleon led the Guards' attack down into the valley, but then he retreated. He went back to the position on his own ridge where he'd been directing things. There's a lot of debate about the state of his health, his energy levels, whether he'd lost his touch by this stage in his career. But compared to our movie general, he still had a few tricks up his sleeve. So during this final attack, he told his officers that should they see large numbers of soldiers pouring onto the battlefield from the flanks, they were French reinforcements, even though he knew full well that this was the Prussians arriving to surround him. The other irony in this scene is that the Duke of Wellington was actually extremely energetic on the day, riding from square to square. He had a lot of aides killed by cannon fire, whereas here, he hasn't budged an inch since the battle started.
Sir! Blucher!
Thank God.
The Prussians under Marshal Blucher charge onto the battlefield, and it's all over for Napoleon. He is left no reserve to deal with or at least delay this threat from the Prussians, and so everyone is now committed to this confused melee. Wellington comments as if he's very relieved to have these reinforcements, but in reality he's been at no threat of losing this battle. Napoleon has made it extremely easy for him. In the actual battle, the Prussians really arrived from Napoleon's rear and on the left of Wellington's ridge, and there was intense fighting at a place called Plancenoit, where 10 battalions of Napoleon's elite guards held off the Prussians for quite a long time. This encirclement was actually quite a gradual process. Wellington's battle plan from the very beginning had been this hammer and anvil approach, where he was to hold his ground and the Prussians were to arrive behind Napoleon to close the trap. But when they did arrive, he was very close to collapsing. The entire ridge would have been absolutely covered by mangled bodies at this point. One of the really disappointing things with this movie is we don't get to see our general discuss his battle plans, display his mastery of recruitment, logistics, artillery. Yes, there do seem to be occasions where the enemy walk into a carefully prepared trap, but in reality, I don't think those would have gone to plan. Generally speaking, he's taking really big gambles. And as soon as his plan goes wrong, our movie general shows no capacity for changing his approach. His use of the different arms of his military, so infantry, cavalry, artillery, doesn't really play to their strengths. We don't really see them working together in coordination either. Now, the real Napoleon was notoriously reckless with the lives of his soldiers. He once allegedly boasted that he could afford to lose 30,000 men a month, but the soldiers still loved him because he usually won the battle. I worry that our movie Napoleon would lose 30,000 men a month and still suffer defeat every time. So, could you survive under this movie general? Based on the evidence, I don't think so, but please tell us what you think in the comments. Let us know who you'd like us to review next, and please subscribe to the channel. A big thank you to War Thunder for sponsoring this episode. Make sure to play it now for free on PC, PlayStation, Xbox or mobile using my links in the pinned comment or video description. Those of you who are new or returning after a break of at least 6 months will receive a massive bonus pack on PC and consoles, including premium vehicles, 100,000 Silver Lions, and 7 days of premium account. It's available for a limited time only, so claim it now.